Hello, this is my introduction slide for our course, Advanced Seminar in Qualitative Research. And I just wanted to introduce myself. Here is a picture of me, and my name is Anate Vasquez, which I probably should have typed out for you. My first name is Latvian, and my last name is Honduran, but I was born in Pensacola, Florida. I'm a first-generation American. And I am in the graduate certificate program for interdisciplinary qualitative studies. So I'm not degree seeking. I already have a PhD, but my PhD program was heavily focused on quantitative research. So I am taking these courses to learn more about qualitative research. A little bit about me is that I did teach grades 6 through 11 for 11 years. All of my teaching experience was in Florida, in Citrus County and Pinellas County, which is like Homosassa Springs and then the St. Pete Clearwater area. During my last 2 years of teaching, I began working on my PhD and only taking one class a semester, so it took me a while to finish my PhD. I got it at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and this is my dissertation title, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But it was about teacher efficacy and the relationship to reading scores for students in 9th and 10th grade. But my research interests have changed dramatically since then, and I am now focused on the preparation of teachers, so pre-service teachers. Lots of aspects about that, field experiences, relationships with supervisors, cooperating teachers, those sorts of things, but most of what I have written is about preparing teachers to work with diverse learners. And then when I write in my content area, which is English education, I do a lot of writing about critical literacy. And some personal stuff about me is that my father is in the military, he's in the Navy, as you can tell from the uniform, and because of that, I have two loves. And my first love is a love of travel. And every year I try to do some kind of trip, sometimes domestic, sometimes international. And last year I took a 2-week trip to South Africa and spent 1 week traveling around Cape Town and its environs. And then I went up north in South Africa and did a safari. So here's a picture of me at the Cape of Good Hope. And then my other love is a love of the water. I guess that's what comes from having a dad in the Navy. Before I moved to the Metro Atlanta area, I had never lived more than 6 miles from an ocean in my life. So that's been a big, big change. And this is my favorite beach in the world. And it's Siesta Key in Sarasota, Florida. And this is my favorite beach access. But since we don't have the beach near Metro Atlanta, the closest beach is 5.5 hours drive away, I have taken to hiking to waterfalls because I just love to be around water. And I managed to find a house that is within walking distance of a lake, Lake Allatoona. So it gives me a little fix. It's not quite the same as the water though. But one thing I do love about living in Georgia, and in this area particularly, is because we are so close to the North Georgia mountains and some great camping and hiking, and I love to camp, and here's my little camp set up at Black Rock Mountain State Park. And then when it's too cold to tent camp, I love to stay in yurts, and I have lots of friends who will come with me and stay in yurts. And if you've never done it, I highly recommend it. This one is at Tougaloo State Park, but there are yurts at about 7 state parks. And then we were asked if we had any milestones during the semester. And a big milestone for me is that I turned 50 this Wednesday, January 17th. So that's a milestone. I don't mind getting older, though. The older I get, the less I think what people care. So that's a good thing. And we were asked to talk about what quantitative and qualitative... No, we were asked what qualitative research is and why it's important. I realized I flip-flopped those two words. And to talk about this, I'm going to go back to my dissertation. So one of the big findings in my dissertation was that despite the fact that teachers had years of data in which controlling for prior learning, students did not achieve a year's worth of learning in a year, those teachers still rated themselves as being highly efficacious. So that's fact. I found that out from the numbers. Well, as far as much as a thing can be fact. I know there are all kinds of problems with standardized tests and for they're reliable and valid and whatnot, but that just struck me. And in doing a quantitative study, I couldn't investigate why that was. And so that's where qualitative research comes in. I would love to go back and ask the question or research, how do classroom teachers continue to feel efficacious despite the fact that a majority of their students' scores on standardized tests do not improve from year to year? So that is information I could find out through a qualitative study, which I think would be more interesting and more useful in the long run, quite honestly. And so I think that it's important because it allows you to dig deeply and to investigate the why and the how instead of just the what, which is what I think is more quantitative. And then we were also asked that based on the readings that we did for this section, what are some of the major issues in teaching research methods that we will attend to while developing our courses this semester? And, oh, that's kind of hard to read, sorry. The biggest thing that struck me was mentioned in both articles. In the Waite article, when he was talking about pedagogicization, I believe it said, he talked about another book. He alluded to another book, and he said that this schoolmaster, I can't say his name, schoolmaster is ignorant of the supposed presumed inequality thought to exist between people. And in that way, he was talking about how a teacher could teach what the teacher doesn't really know, and how can that be true? And it connected really nicely to the other article when the authors talked about the reflexivity of teacher as learner continues to be a strong tenet of expert practice. And I think these two things are really talking about the same thing, and that is that it's important that you learn with your students, that you realize that they bring things to the classroom, that you should honor potentially things that you know nothing about, and that it's very important to make sure that you as a teacher are continuously learning also, and that your students know that about you. It reminds me when I was teaching high school English, I had to teach a book called Pedro Páramo by Juan Ruiz. It's a Mexican, the author is Mexican and it's set in Mexico. And honestly, when you read it, you don't know which characters are living and which characters are dead, and I really didn't understand it. But fortunately, I had a good enough relationship with my students, and I felt confident enough that I could just tell them, hey, I don't really get this book, but we're going to figure it out together. So I think showing yourself as a constant learner is very important, and that's something I'll definitely attend to when I'm designing a course. And then Waite also talks about the intrapersonal and the interpersonal. And the intrapersonal was also kind of alluded to in the other article. So in the interpersonal, Waite was talking about motivation and, your personal qualities that the learner has and also that the teacher has, and how those things interact with themselves. And he also talks about the fact that he thought his students were just lazy because they weren't reading intensively. And so he ended up changing his mind and restructuring his course. And in the other article, in the second section, when they're talking about approaches to experiential learning, one of the people on the panel talked about the need to meet students where they are. They all come to you with different abilities, different prior knowledge, and that you really should meet students where they are, which is basically what I think Waite was saying in the other article, and I think that's true. Very difficult to do, but true. And then Waite also talked about the interpersonal when he was talking about taking his graduate student around to conferences and introducing him to people and developing a relationship with that person. And I think that is very important too. And let me look at my notes for a second, because there was something else I wanted to add there. Let's see. He talked about the individual qualities of the instructor and the instructor's pedagogy, as well as the identification of the teacher with the subject. And I think that this relates to reflexivity that was being talked about in the second article, because one of the examples that Waite gives is talking about how students will say things like, you don't want to take a class from Professor X because either he or she is portrayed as difficult or has a reputation as inflecting whatever she teaches with a heavy dose of feminist post-structural theory, or because he is more of an ethnographer of the old school, and so on. And so I think that it's important to be very reflexive, which was talked about in the second article, because while, yes, we are all going to come to teaching from our own perspectives and our own interests, we need to be highly reflexive and make sure that our own interests and beliefs are not infringing upon students' abilities to develop their own thoughts and beliefs. So I thought that was interesting. And then the main things that Waite talked about, the fieldwork methods, talking about data gathering, and then thinking, talking about analysis and interpretation and writing. I think those are all important. However, I don't think you could teach them all in one class, so I probably will focus more on one of those rather than all of them. Just like in our program right now, we take the course that is sort of the philosophical underpinnings of different schools of thought, and then we take a class on designing research, and then we take a class on analyzing the data. So I do think you have to break that up, because you cannot do it all in one semester if you want to do it well. And then the second article had a little bit more examples. They had more examples of things, so making research visible. They talked about using a hook to get students' interests. And in using a hook, they talked about four actually different ways of doing that. And those ways were active learning, problem-based learning. I'm looking for that page. And advanced apprentice model. Sorry for that pause. It actually was just 3. So I agree with all of those. I think you have to get students connected and excited about what they're going to be doing. I do see, though, where it's difficult because students don't have data with them that they're already interested in and that they know how to gather. So that could be a really difficult thing to do. And then approaches to experiential learning. Was about learning through experience and actually doing research. And then reflection on research practice is when we come to the reflexivity portion, which I already talked about when I was talking about Waite's interpersonal relationship section. So those are a lot of the things that I thought were very interesting and need to be attended to. I know that Waite focused a lot more on political aspects of teaching and hierarchies of knowledge. The second article touched a little bit on the politics, and I think that's important, but especially if you want to prepare people to work in academia. but I also don't think we should bog students down with that. A lot of my program, my PhD program, was spent talking about the sort of conflict between quantitative and qualitative methods, and I'd wish we'd spent less time on that and more time on learning how to do research. And then the whole thing about departmental hierarchy and teaching research methods is thought to be more prominent than teaching some other courses. I mean, I think you can mention that just so that they are prepared for it, but I think it should be sort of a minor focus of the class. You all might disagree with me. So I look forward to hearing about you, and we'll enjoy taking this class with you. Have a good afternoon.